Hello and welcome to Money News on Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us now is Tim Kane. He's the chief economist at the Hudson Institute and the founder of the social networking firm StoryPoint. Mr. Kane, it's great to talk with you.
Great, thanks, John.
Okay, so the U.S. unemployment rate fell to 7.8% in September, down from 8.1% in August, largely due to a pickup in part-time hiring. What's your take on that number? Does an increase in part-time jobs indicate a pickup in activity at startup businesses, or is it the opposite?
Yeah, it's a bizarre report, to say the least. The payroll number, which liberals have been saying for the whole decade that I've been here in this town, the payroll number is the one you got to watch. Well, it's disastrous. It's not keeping up with population growth. And then if you turn to the household survey, as you pointed out, there's a big boom in part-time jobs, but I think that fits in with some of the research I've done that says, if you layer up full-time employment with a lot of regulations and mandatory benefits, it's the natural impulse for employers to shift to contractors and to part-time work. So it's not a healthy report by any means, and I think you probably know this. That's not the real unemployment rate. It's a measure of the unemployment rate based on the population that's willing to work or look for work that's not so discouraged. The real unemployment rate is 4% higher probably.
You also talked about the state of entrepreneurship in the United States, and now it's weaker than ever. And I recently read a report that said in countries like even Italy, there's more startups now than in the United States. What will it take to restore that market back to health? Are tax and regulatory policies really the root of this country's ailments when it comes to new businesses, startups, and entrepreneurship?
Right. Yeah, John, I've been thinking about entrepreneurship for a long time. Even when I was in grad school working on a PhD in economics, a friend of mine asked for my help with a technology startup, and I kind of got into that world. So I've continued to work on startups and mentor others who are doing startups. And when particularly the research that I've done in the last few years, what I've learned is entrepreneurship's natural. People want to start their own companies, but they face trade-offs because there's a lot in our country you have to give up to take that risk. And I think the discouraging thing is we've seen the entrepreneurship rate decline, and it's been declining for, 20 years, but in a really gradual level. Suddenly in the last 3 years, it's just collapsed. It's dropped by a third. And the really scary thing is it's gotten worse each year. So, the officials tell us we've been in a recovery for 2 years. The entrepreneurship rate is actually lower this year than it was last.
And let's go a little bit further back than that. The number of startup jobs dropped in 2006. Or I should say the number of startup firms dropped in 2006, but the level of jobs at startups appeared to have peaked back in 2000, or 6 years earlier than that. Now, that's all according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What does that indicate?
Well, there are a couple of different ways to look at this. One is the number of startups or the number of startup jobs per capita. So in absolute terms, you might see a peak at a different time. I think if we adjust it by the population size, at least one look at this that I did in a recent report, it was about 5 years ago. So I think that would be 2007, 2008, that it was basically at a pretty steady level where it had been. The recession made a hit, but it was a much bigger drop than we've ever seen before. As I said, a drop by about a third in the amount of jobs at startup companies, and a drop, and I'm sorry I don't have the number right at hand, but a drop in the number of companies themselves. So both of those are concerned.
When one often talks about startup companies, obviously tech comes to mind, things like Facebook and Twitter and Dell, Instagram, those new companies. Is that really the case, or are we looking at other sectors of the economy where we're seeing startup companies in certain areas?
As important as a company like Google or Facebook is, neither of those companies employs hundreds of thousands of people. They tend to have a pretty small footprint. When we think of entrepreneurship, we really need to think about the mom and pops that are opening, say, a new stand at a mall. I like to tell the story about Five Guys. That was a startup that was a hamburger chain 15 or so years ago. So there are tons of startups every year, and in fact, the data show there are 3 million jobs created on average over the last 3 decades at these new companies. And new doesn't mean small. They could be medium-sized, they could be large companies. In contrast, John, existing firms, whether they're 2 years old or 200, lump them all together, they lose about 1 million jobs a year. So if we see this drop-off in startups, it's not going to come from anywhere else. That's the whole ballgame.
You've also said that jobs normally created at startups are being sent offshore. Is that because of labor costs are cheaper in other places, or does it have more to do with taxes and regulations? And also, can those jobs ever come back?
Yeah, that's a concern I have, and it's really drawn from personal experience. There are some new websites that allow you to tap into a global labor market. You can go to guru.com or elance.com. That actually helps a lot of American workers who want to set up shop, but they know there's not enough business, say, in Toledo or Akron, so they can appeal to not only a national a group of companies that might hire them for their services, but internationally. But it's a different sort of employment relationship when you're an entrepreneur. You're selling a service, you're not becoming an employee. Well, the flip side of that is that companies now have access to a global talent pool. So here's the question. Should the government make it hard for me as an entrepreneur to hire an American worker, to pay extra taxes, to obey extra regulations? And also the IRS did a crackdown on companies hiring American independent contractors, saying, well, those are maybe employees. That doesn't happen if you hire someone to provide a service from anywhere else in the world. So I think the government really needs to rethink why they're cracking down on hiring Americans.
So you're saying that the Obama administration has actually made it harder to hire American workers in that particular instance you just brought up?
Yeah, we know there's been a crackdown. There was announced crackdown by the IRS on this specific issue of independent contractors. There's a technical rule called, I think it's 530, the safe harbor for companies that hire independent contractors, that has been proposed for repeal by the administration. These are things I think we need to take a closer look at and just re-examine the whole question of independent contractors. And let's encourage that instead of discourage it. And you know, John, why that happened, I think, is if you're an independent contractor, you don't get health benefits. You're not in the health insurance pool. And with their big push for Obamacare, that was something they were very concerned about. They need to get everybody in the employer pool for health care. And maybe that's the wrong approach. I don't think it's going to be working 20, 30 years when we really do have a global labor market.
Yeah, and healthcare costs are certainly on the rise in terms of employees and employers as well. We want to get your take on the candidates in this presidential race. What's your take on GOP candidate Mitt Romney's tax and regulatory proposals?
I really like his concept of focusing on entrepreneurs. Of course, you can tell with my background. So I think that's a winner. I think higher taxes on high-income earners, it's a great soundbite, but for anybody in my line of work, anybody, frankly, with an economics PhD should know that it's not just rich people you hit when you have higher tax rates, it's entrepreneurs. Let me just tell you one story. This company that I had, we were in business for 4 years. We never took a salary. We were in the group of Americans who weren't paying taxes. We had one good year when we sold the company. It was a great year, but then Uncle Sam came in and said, oh, you're one of the rich guys now. Well, that lasted for 1 year. So it's really punitive to success to have a tax rate that is this steeply progressive. And I think moving toward a flatter tax code, lesser deductions, would be much fairer and boost economic growth, and that's the important thing.
And how about President Obama? What would a re-election mean for startups in the country?
Well, based on the track record, we've already seen entrepreneurship rates and hiring rates drop by about a third. If it drops by another third, and the CBO's already warned, we're at the edge of a recession. And I think what we'll see is, if another 4 years of an Obama presidency, we're going to continue to see very meek growth and almost no job creation.
You talked about the potential for a double-dip recession. Of course, the fiscal cliff has been on businesses' minds and has them on edge as far as their plans to expand and has put their plans to hire additional workers on hold. Now, once that cliff passes and the uncertainty is over, do you expect more businesses to launch, and will startups take on new employees?
Yeah, it makes me gnash my teeth. We've been saying for a long time, uncertainty matters. You can't just write out a Keynesian model of the macroeconomy and you see a drop-off in consumption, just throw more government spending. They promised us that would work. A lot of us who've been studying economics said it's not going to work. It's why you saw it be a very partisan, divisive bill, and it didn't work. I don't think we're going to see any change, and that's what really concerns me. Is they're not thinking of fundamentals, they're not thinking of incentives in this administration.
In terms of overall companies, not just startups, they say they do want to hire, but say there are too few workers who have the necessary skills and education. I've heard numbers like there's 4.7 million jobs out there that have gone unfilled because workers don't have the required skills. Do you agree with that, and what needs to happen to remedy this situation?
I don't agree with it. There's this notion that after the public has provided 18 years or so of education, that gee, nobody's prepared for the workforce, and that's ridiculous. I think the best sort of job training you can get is not job training from the federal government or not job training from some local bureaucrat. It's on-the-job training. It's getting a job is the best training you can have. And maybe that's at a fast food restaurant, or, when I was a kid, I worked at a restaurant, a busboy, and I was a waiter. It taught me all the important skills, all the soft skills about working well with others, showing up on time, working hard, being part of a team. We need to encourage that. And what's making it so hard for people to get that first rung on the ladder? Things like the minimum wage, that we have one national minimum wage. It was cranked up incredibly high. We have incentives for people not to work. And so, one of the issues in this country is a poverty trap. So I worry about high marginal tax rates. The highest marginal tax rates are for people that make $25,000. If they want to make $35,000, they effectively they lose more than $1 for every dollar of income they gain, because they lose so many benefits that are steeply means tested. And that's the war on poverty that started with LBJ. Let's rethink that.
It might be time, and a lot of people might agree with you on that point. Tim Kane,